For many, the mere mention of classic ghost stories brings to mind foggy London streets, Victorian drawing rooms, or stately homes in the English countryside. In other words, quintessentially British settings. And it is undeniable that British and Irish authors created the vast majority of what we now consider classic ghost stories. That said, today on the Literate Ghost Recommends, we will be hopping the pond, so to speak. Join us as we celebrate American Independence Day with 7 classic ghost stories from the Americans. Our first story is from author, journalist, Civil War soldier, and infamous curmudgeon Ambrose Bierce. Known as Bitter Bierce for his cynical views and writing style, Bierce was, during his lifetime, known more for his newspaper work than his literary fiction. Today, he's mostly remembered for his satirical collection of humorous definitions, known as the Devil's Dictionary, and for his short story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. He was also known for his short stories involving mysterious and inexplicable disappearances, which proved to be somewhat ironic in that Bierce himself disappeared without a trace in 1914. One of his best short stories featuring such a disappearance is The Spook House, first published in the San Francisco Examiner in 1889. Our tale takes place shortly before the American Civil War, somewhere in rural eastern Kentucky. The exact location is unknown, as the house in question was burned down during the war, but it was known to be somewhere along the road heading north from Manchester to Boonville. Here stood a vacant house described only as a wooden plantation house of better make. As of 1862, the house was still standing, but it had been vacant for 4 or 5 years and had fallen into disrepair, many of the neighboring poor folks picking it clean of any and all movable property and pulling apart the outbuildings and fences as a cheap source of fuel. This they did only during the day, of course, as no one would approach the house by night. It had garnered an evil reputation and was known locally as the Spook House. That it was tenanted by evil spirits, visible, audible, and active, no one in all that region doubted any more than he doubted what he was told of Sundays by the traveling preacher. Its owner's opinion of the matter was unknown. He and his family had disappeared one night, and no trace of them had ever been found. Years later, 2 gentlemen, Colonel J.C. McCardle, a lawyer, and one Judge Myron Vey, were traveling from Boonville to Manchester, having important business to conduct there, when they found themselves caught up in a heavy thunderstorm just as they were passing the house. Not being from the area, they assumed that the inhabitants of the house did not answer their knocking due to the uproar of the storm. They pushed their way through one of the doors and into the house, and shut the door behind them. That instant they were in darkness and silence. Not a gleam of the lightning's unceasing blaze penetrated the windows or crevices. Not a whisper of the awful tumult without reached them there. It was as if they had suddenly been stricken blind and deaf, and McCardle afterwards said that for a moment he believed himself to have been killed by a stroke of lightning as he crossed the threshold. I turned the doorknob and pulled open the door. It led into another room. This apartment was suffused with a faint greenish light, the source of which I could not determine, making everything distinctly visible, though nothing was sharply defined. Everything, I say, but in truth the only objects within the blank stone walls of that room were human corpses. Next up, we take to the seas with the American author and worldwide traveler Frances Marion Crawford. Although an American by birth, Crawford was more of a world citizen. He was born in the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, attended St. Paul's School in New Hampshire, then Cambridge University, the University of Heidelberg, and the University of Rome, before moving to India to study Sanskrit. After returning to America in 1881, he attended Harvard University. Once he proved himself as a successful novelist, he returned to Italy where he established Villa Crawford, which would be his permanent home for the remainder of his life. Although he wrote a number of successful novels, he is mostly remembered today for his classic ghost stories, the very best of which illustrates his love-hate relationship with the world of travel by steamship in The Upper Berth, first published in 1885 in Unwin's Annual for 1886. One dull evening in the cigar lounge of his club, Mr. Brisbane relates the frightening tale of why he refuses to travel by a certain steamship, a ship that had until recently been one of his favorites. Suddenly, as I stood, I distinctly heard something moving behind me in one of the berths, and a moment afterwards, just as I turned instinctively to look, though I could of course see nothing in the darkness, I heard a very faint groan. I sprang across the stateroom and tore the curtains of the upper berth aside, thrusting in my hands to discover if there were anyone there. There was someone. I remember that the sensation as I put my hands forward was as though I were plunging them into the air of a damp cellar, and from behind the curtain came a gust of wind that smelled horribly of stagnant seawater. I laid hold of something that had the shape of a man's arm, but was smooth and wet and icy cold. But suddenly, as I pulled, the creature sprang violently forward against me, a clammy, oozy mass, as it seemed to me, heavy and wet, yet endowed with a sort of supernatural strength. I reeled across the stateroom, and in an instant the door opened, and the thing rushed out. Our next story is by one of our personal favorite ghost story authors, Mary Elizabeth Wilkins Freeman. Unlike the other authors in this collection, Mary did not write as a hobby or a side career or on a whim. She wrote out of necessity. After the death of her parents, her writing provided her only source of income, and she proved to be very successful. As you can imagine, her writings tended to focus less upon the lives of the privileged upper class than upon the realistic depiction of the domestic lives of everyday Americans. The story we have chosen for today is one of her most popular, The Shadows on the Wall, first published in Everybody's Magazine in 1903 and included in the short story collection The Wind in the Rosebush and Other Stories of the Supernatural that same year. The Glynn sisters gathered at their family home to mourn the sudden death of their brother Edward. Their older brother Henry had made no pretense at hiding the fact that he wanted Edward out of the house. I heard him tell Edward that he had no business here at all, and he thought he had better go away. What did Edward say? That he would stay here as long as he lived, and afterward, too, if he was a mind to, and he would like to see Henry get him out. Shortly after Edward's death, Henry came home to find his sisters arguing over lighting a lamp in the study. They had found that a strange shadow threw itself upon the wall, a shadow that seemed to have no source, and far worse, it looked like Edward. The door opened suddenly, and Henry Glynn entered. He began to speak, then his eyes followed the direction of the others. "What is that?" he demanded. Some of the best classic ghost story authors find their inspiration in and from their nightmares. This is especially true of our next author. Although mostly remembered today for his horror stories, Edward Lucas White was first and foremost a teacher. After graduating from Johns Hopkins University, he taught classics at several Baltimore schools, including the University School for Boys, which is now known as the Boys' Latin School of Maryland, from which he retired in 1930. During this time, he developed the habit of recording his more frightening dreams. After waking from vivid or terrifying dreams, he would often write them down with little alteration. The most famous of these stories is Lukundoo, first published in Weird Tales in 1925, and included in the collection Lukundoo and Other Stories in 1927. This story takes us to the jungles of deepest Africa, as our narrator, a man named Singleton, relates a horrifying tale of his experiences there while exploring for pygmies. Late one afternoon there came into our camp an Englishman, and pretty well used up he was, too. We had heard no rumor of him. He had not only heard of us, but had made an amazing 5-day march to reach us. His name was Etcham. Etcham, it appears, was in a dire situation, as the leader of his expedition was very ill. He had come looking for help. Etcham reveals that his leader is none other than Ralph Stone, the famous American explorer. Even in the jungle they had heard of his many exploits, including an incident where he had humiliated a tribal witch doctor. They find Stone far gone, in a stupor and oblivious to his surroundings. That night they discover the horrible truth behind his illness. The swelling on his right breast had broken. Von Richten aimed the center line of the light at it, and we saw it plainly. From his flesh, grown out of it, there protruded a head, such a head as the dried specimen Etcham had shown us. It was black, shining black. It rolled the whites of its wicked, wee eyes and showed its microscopic teeth. It turned malignantly from side to side and chittered incessantly in that inconceivable falsetto. Elia Wilkinson Peattie was a prolific author and journalist. She began as a reporter with the Chicago Tribune, then the Chicago Daily News and the Omaha World Herald, where she became the chief editorial writer. She also wrote a history of America for young people, a novel about the Children's Crusade, numerous magazine articles, and a tour guide of Alaska. Amongst all of this, she found time to write short stories. One of the funniest happens to be a ghost story, A Grammatical Ghost, first published in the collection The Shape of Fear and Other Ghostly Tales in 1898. There was only one possible objection to the drawing room, and that was the occasional presence of Miss Carew. And only one possible objection to Miss Carew, and that was that she was dead. She had been dead 20 years, as a matter of fact and record, and to the last of her life sacredly preserved the treasures and traditions of her family, a family bound up, as it is quite unnecessary to explain to anyone in good society, with all that was most venerable and heroic in the history of the Republic. It is not likely that, having lived a life of such irreproachable gentility as this, Miss Carew would have the bad taste to die in any way not pleasant to mention in fastidious society. She died very unobtrusively of an affection of the heart one June morning, while trimming her rose trellis, and her lavender-colored print was not even rumpled when she fell. Years later, distant relatives of Miss Carew would come into possession of her home and property, and although they had the unfortunately undignified name of Boggs, Miss Carew made their acquaintance nonetheless. They entered their drawing-room with the intention of brewing a cup of tea and drinking it in calm sociability in the twilight. But as they entered the room, they became aware of the presence of a lady who was already seated at their tea-table. There were a number of peculiarities about this intruder, not the least of which was the resemblance this lady bore to a faded daguerreotype. If looked at one way, she was perfectly discernible. If looked at another, she went out in a sort of blur. "I beg your pardon," began Miss Prudence, but at this moment the daguerreotype became a blur, and Miss Prudence found herself addressing space. Miss Boggs looked at Miss Prudence Boggs. "If there were ghosts," she said, "this would be one." "If there were ghosts," said Miss Prudence Boggs, "this would be the ghost of Lydia Carew." Our next author is one of the most well-known names in today's list, even though he wrote very few ghost stories. He is, in fact, known for an altogether different talent. Ralph Adams Cram was a famous and influential American architect, known primarily for his Gothic Revival style. Among his works are the United States Military Academy at West Point, many college campuses, including Princeton University, where he was the lead architect for over 20 years, and numerous public libraries, churches, and cathedrals. He was also the head of the architectural department at MIT, and was heavily involved in various Anglo-Catholic societies and publications. The Episcopal Church dedicates December 16th as a feast day in honor of Cram's contributions to church architecture. As for his writing, the majority of his work was in the fields of architecture and religion. His ghost stories were obviously a mere hobby. That said, he produced one volume of very highly respected tales in the collection Black Spirits and White, a book of ghost stories, published in 1895. The most popular of these stories is The Dead Valley. Two young boys find themselves lost in the countryside when they encounter a strange, lifeless valley. A great oval basin, almost as smooth and regular as though made by man. On all sides the grass crept over the brink of the encircling hills, dusty green on the crests, then fading into ashy brown, and so to a deadly white. And then, nothing. Bare, brown, hard earth, glittering with grains of alkali, but otherwise dead and barren. Not a tuft of grass, not a stick of brushwood, not even a stone, but only the vast expanse of beaten clay. In the midst of the basin, perhaps a mile and a half away, the level expanse was broken by a great dead tree, rising, leafless and gaunt, into the air. As I drew near the skeleton tree, I noticed the glint of sunlight on a kind of white mound around its roots, and I wondered curiously. It was not until I had come close that I saw its nature. All around the roots and barkless trunk was heaped a wilderness of little bones, and tiny skulls of rodents and of birds, thousands of them rising about the dead tree and streaming off for several yards in all directions, until the dreadful pile ended in isolated skulls and scattered skeletons. Here and there a larger bone appeared, the thigh of a sheep, the hooves of a horse, and to one side, grinning slowly, a human skull. Our final author for today arrives a bit late on the timeline from which we typically consider the age of the classic ghost story. Nevertheless, his writing certainly carries on the feel and conventions associated with Golden Age ghost stories, and we've decided to include him here today. Dr. David H. Keller was a physician and psychiatrist that specialized in the treatment of shell-shocked soldiers and other patients suffering from mental trauma. He took up writing purely as a form of recreation, and had written over a dozen novels and 50 short stories before his wife convinced him to try publishing them. His most often anthologized story is a classic little tale called The Thing in the Cellar, first published in Weird Tales magazine in 1932. A small boy is deeply afraid of something in the cellar. Something no one else can sense. It was a large cellar, entirely out of proportion to the house above it. The owner admitted that it was probably built for a distinctly different kind of structure from the one which rose above it. A winding stone stairway connected the cellar with the kitchen. Around the base of this series of steps, successive owners of the house had placed their firewood, winter vegetables, and junk. The junk had gradually been pushed back till it rose head-high in a barricade of uselessness. What was back of that barricade no one knew, and no one cared. For some hundreds of years no one had crossed it to penetrate to the black reaches of the cellar behind it. At the top of the steps separating the kitchen from the cellar was a stout oaken door. This door was, in a way, as peculiar and out of relation to the rest of the house as the cellar. It was a strange kind of door, and certainly a most unusual door to find in the inside of a house. Thick, stoutly built, rabbeted together, with huge wrought-iron hinges. Little Tommy Tucker hated being in the kitchen, and would do almost anything to remove himself from that area of the house. It was obvious that he was terrified of something in the cellar. His parents, although patient while he was a baby, began to be concerned as Tommy came of school age. They decided to follow their doctor's advice by nailing the kitchen door open. Tommy was to stay alone in the kitchen for a single hour. What could go wrong? After all, there couldn't really be anything down in the cellar. Could there? And there you have it. 7 classic ghost stories from the Americans. Of course, there are many other great classic ghost stories from American authors, and we couldn't possibly include them all in this short video. We would also recommend authors such as Henry James, Edgar Allan Poe, Washington Irving, Edith Wharton, Robert W. Chambers, and Gertrude Atherton, amongst others. Thanks for watching, and to our fellow Americans, happy 4th of July.